Or need to stop the Serb offensive in Kosovo. Many Kosovar Albanians, of course, believe NATO's right.
The Serbian military machine cannot go on for long like this. They hope that very soon NATO will be able to take on Serbian tanks, and you hardly see a Serbian soldier away from a Serbian tank. They don't engage their foot soldiers because they lack motivation. They don't want to die for Kosovo.
Tonight, claim and counterclaim continues. Serbia says its jets have attacked Kosovan separatist bases. NATO says it has shot down 2 Serb planes. Whatever the truth is, it is clear that on its 3rd day, this war has escalated into the air and into daylight hours.
Deny flight, which patrols the airspace of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the no-fly zone there, and they've been patrolling there since 1995. The planes that shot down the 2 Yugoslav fighters were not in any way connected to the airstrike operation that is currently going on with over Yugoslavia. Now, we're told that the latest thing is that we're told that the encounter occurred today at approximately 5:15 local time, that's Central European, and it occurred over the skies of Bosnia-Herzegovina in the vicinity of a town called Tiočak, which is on the Yugoslav border. Now, here with me at the moment is Dr. Jamie Shea, the NATO spokesman, who can perhaps bring us up to date a little bit more on what has been going on. Now, Dr. Shea, can you tell us a little bit about Operation Deny Flight and what they've been doing since 1995?
Well, since 1995, Patricia, as you said very well yourself, we've been maintaining a no-fly zone over Bosnia as part of the Dayton Peace Agreement. That is ongoing. And, of course, at the moment, those planes are in a very high state of vigilance to ensure that Yugoslavia does not try to attack NATO forces as you say, in the SFOR, the NATO Stabilization Force in Bosnia. And that may have been the intention of these MiGs this afternoon flying into the Bosnian airspace, and that's why, of course, they were engaged immediately by NATO, and 2 of the aircraft have been shot down.
Now, I've heard reports out of SHAPE headquarters, the military headquarters of NATO, that the pilots were seen parachuting, but you're telling us now they were captured.
Yes, the latest information I have is that once they landed on the ground, they were detained immediately by SFOR soldiers, and they are, of course, in detention at the present time.
Now, what is going to happen to those pilots in detention? Can you explain what the procedure is?
They will be kept in detention until such time as this current Kosovo crisis has been resolved, and then, of course, they will be handed back to their national authorities.
An important issue, the clusters of targets that have been hit and also where they've checked. And so, yes, they're around the 3 capitals, Belgrade, Pristina, Podgorica. You've got the keys there. It's interesting, there's only 1 target they've said they have destroyed, which suggests it will never operate again, which is a surface-to-air missile site outside Belgrade. But that is the only SAM site they reckon they've done any major absolute damage to. A couple of other ones and surface-to-air missile support sites, again around Belgrade, they say they've inflicted severe damage, but we perhaps should be quite careful about that. Bombing reports on Iraq in the past have talked about destroyed severe damage. Often they've turned out to be not quite right. Though overall, looking at the list and looking at the target clusters, and again around Pristina, there's perhaps an interesting point. Most of the targets around there have been ammunition depots, they've been command centres for the Pristina, the Kosovo army base. They have been support facilities, fuel dumps and so forth, targets which obviously NATO says attacking these, destroying these, will limit the capability of the Yugoslav army at present operating in Kosovo, and we just saw the report of the refugees coming out. So,
on day 3 of Operation Allied Force, Yugoslavia shows no signs of backing down, and NATO launches its first daylight attack. Here you see the launch of a Navy Tomahawk cruise missile streaking toward a target in Yugoslavia. It was fired from the USS Philippine Sea in the Adriatic Friday afternoon, a day when the Pentagon says NATO has begun to target Serbian and Yugoslav forces in Kosovo. Neighboring Macedonia. CNN's Chris Burns reports.
Ethnic Albanian refugees from Kosovo trickle over the border into Macedonia, bringing with them a few belongings and stories of violence and terror. The accounts lend credence to reports that the Serb-led Yugoslav army has cracked down even harder on ethnic Albanians as it battles the Kosovo Liberation Army. That despite NATO's devastating airstrikes.
Things happened tonight. There was a lot of shooting, setting houses and stores ablaze.
Since international observers, most aid groups, and international journalists have left, the Yugoslav army and uncontrolled Serb elements have reportedly stepped up their attacks on civilians. A field officer of the UN High Commission for Refugees says Yugoslav soldiers executed 20 men in the town of Gjakovo on Thursday. And there are reports of other atrocities, unconfirmed up to now, but here they are, a couple more. Humanitarian Law Center says a human rights attorney and his two sons were found murdered outside Pristina, and the agency of the Kosovo Liberation, the press agency of the Kosovo Liberation Army says that there were mass executions, including 20 slain in Orahovac and 10 in Podujevo. But what's difficult is that without international observers or journalists in Kosovo, it's very difficult to verify. Judy?
Sky behind us, some very bright lights approaching now, and this certainly looks like one of these huge B-52 bombers returning to base.
Now, what we
when
don't
it
know...
gets nearer, we'll be able to hear it, and then we know for sure that it's a B-52.
Now, you were explaining to us a little earlier, Andrew, that some of these planes took off first thing this morning and others took off around about lunchtime. So, of course, we don't know which of these this is.
No, we don't. My own guess is the ones that took off first thing this morning at 9:15 this morning were actually going back to the United States. If they'd been on a bombing mission, they would have been gone for some 12 hours now, which seems far too long. But these ones here are returning exactly 10 hours after a group of 3 planes took off at 1:15 at lunchtime. So that would be the same 10-hour flying mission that was flown on the first day. And those planes that took off at lunchtime definitely were armed.
When they've come back previously in the last couple of days, have they all come in together or have they been spread out?
They've come in within about 10 minutes of each other. I will just stop talking now and let you hear the sound of this massive plane.
Well, that was number one, Andrew. So any more lights in the sky that you can see that would indicate that another one is on its way?
Not at the moment. Those lights of that particular plane seemed to be hanging in the sky beyond the horizon here for about 10 minutes before it came in. And just at the moment, no more lights behind me. Wait a minute, just in the distance, maybe another plane coming in about 10 minutes or so.
Running reports from Belgrade say that there were 7 huge explosions in the city. 2 MiG-29 warplanes were shot down by NATO fighters. Serb television is claiming 4 NATO jets were brought down and at least 2 pilots captured. The bombing resumed as the United Nations High Commission for Refugees reported that Serb forces were killing ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. Here, Tony Blair went on British television to justify the use of force against Yugoslavia.
Wave after wave of jets climbed into the night sky from their base in Italy as NATO prepared another onslaught against Serb targets. The reason for the action was all too clear on the ground. In Kosovo, rumours of reprisals and further ethnic cleansing spurred thousands of people to leave their homes in search of a safe haven. A trail of refugees heading into the wilderness, justification enough for the British Prime Minister to explain why the action had to continue.
To those who say the aim of military strikes is not clear, I say it is crystal clear. It is to curb Milosevic's ability to wage war on an innocent civilian population. To those who say NATO is striking at a sovereign nation without justification, I say it was Milosevic who scrapped Kosovo's autonomy. 90% of its people are not Serbs. Now they have no rights, no justice, no protection.
NATO claims more Serb warplanes have been shot down this evening, apparently as they tried to attack peacekeeping forces in Bosnia. Video footage from the cockpit of NATO jets back up the politicians' claims that the air attacks are having a great deal of success.
MiG fighters across the border in Bosnia. Mostly Muslim Albanians are fleeing Kosovo, with reports of massacres by mostly Christian Orthodox Serb forces. President Clinton warned the Serbs, those who commit atrocities will be brought to justice. Television's most widely experienced Defense Department correspondent David Martin begins our coverage from the Pentagon.
The crumpled wreckage of a MiG is all that remains of what may have been a dramatic attempt by Serb President Milosevic to widen the war by attacking NATO troops in Bosnia. F-15s on patrol over Bosnia tracked the two MiG-29s as they took off from Serbia and headed west. The evidence is unclear, but the MiGs might have been the lead aircraft in an attempted strike against NATO troops in Bosnia. If so, it was thwarted when the F-15 shot them down.
A second possibility is that they were involved in some sort of a Serb scheme to shoot down one of our planes.
The shoot-down occurred as NATO was about to begin another night of attacks. B-52 bombers took off from England to deliver a salvo of cruise missiles. Other planes flew out of Italy loaded with laser-guided bombs. Air Commodore David Wilby showed off some video of a bomb hitting an ammo dump.
You can tell by the veracity of the fire that's coming out that there has definitely been a fair amount of explosive in there.
But the Serb army in Kosovo is still on a rampage.
Some executions have been reported in a number of towns. Some destruction of villages has been reported in several towns. Certainly there is reason to fear for the worst, and we do fear for the worst.
NATO planes have not yet trained all their firepower on the troops who are doing the killing because they are still concentrating on knocking out Serb air defenses.
Bad weather is rolling in, and that will make it harder to go after the Serb defenses. Excuse me, will make it harder to go after the Serb army. Military officers say that unless Milosevic surrenders, the bombing could continue for at least another week. Dan?
David Martin at the Pentagon. This, the third night of air attacks, is now in full swing with more huge explosions reported from strikes by NATO cruise missiles and bombs. Especially hard hit, expected to be the outskirts of Belgrade. CBS News correspondent Mark Phillips, who was expelled from Yugoslavia after the war began, reports tonight from across the border in Croatia.
The full might of the NATO attack still comes after dark. The southern industrial city of Niš endured a sustained attack, setting off fires that burned into the night. The longer the air raids go on, the more damage they do. But with images provided almost exclusively by Yugoslav television now, the world is getting a selective view. This was said to be damage in Pristina, the Kosovo capital. Much of the NATO attack has been concentrated here in an attempt to stymie the Serb offensive against the Albanian population. While military and industrial installations have been targeted, these Serb TV images show destroyed residences where the Serbs say refugees had been housed. Again, there are no reliable figures on civilian casualties, although the Serbs continue to broadcast images of the wounded, just as they do of the continued defiance of the Yugoslav military. These soldiers said to be maintaining their vigil on the border with Macedonia. The Serbs are not providing images of their continuing campaign against Albanian civilians. The UN in Geneva today spoke of reports of teachers being lined up and shot in front of their students. With the expulsion of Western journalists, it's impossible to confirm those reports. But with NATO attacks so far concentrating on air defenses and military installations, the Serbs on the ground have been given a free hand to continue their campaign of ethnic cleansing without outside observers or interference. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Zagreb.
Government-controlled Serbian television tonight reported at least 7 mighty explosions on the outskirts of the capital city, Belgrade. From on the ground in Belgrade a short time ago, we got an eyewitness telephone report for you from Leanne Martindale of CBS Radio and Television.
I can hear the air sirens. They just went off about 3 minutes ago. About 5 minutes ago, I heard the first explosion. I'm below buildings, so it's difficult for me to get a sense of how far away they are. I would say at least 5 miles away. I heard about 3 explosions, and now it's gone completely silent.
Leanne Martindale of CBS News reporting from Belgrade. For the first time in the war today, NATO launched an airstrike during daylight hours. The cruise missile erupted from a U.S. Navy warship in the Adriatic Sea. CBS's Richard Roth is aboard the USS Philippine Sea on the firing line in the Adriatic.
It was an unexpected order to launch quickly, and for the first time since the strikes began, it happened in daylight. Rising on a blaze of rocket fuel, the cruise missile turned east over the Adriatic, toward land less than 50 miles away. Even officers in the ship's ultra-secret command center wouldn't have known the target. The digital directions were locked in the missile's computer. The job of the USS Philippine Sea is simply to be ready and react.
The fact is, the change in this ship's operation from uneventful cruise to naval combat has not changed most onboard routine, but it has given every sailor here something to think about.
With last night's volley from the USS Gonzales sailing nearby, a total of 35 of the 1.5-ton missiles have been launched from U.S. warships since Wednesday night. For many in the crew, it's a first-time experience in high-tech warfare at sea. But not for Engineman Eric Taylor.
We train to do things that when a situation arises, we have to rise to the occasion.
The Navy says their duty is to protect lives at risk in Yugoslavia with force when necessary. And no one here has been told how long that mission will last. Richard Roth, CBS News, aboard the USS Philippine Sea.
On the political and diplomatic front, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said flatly again today, NATO is united. But there are rumblings of some nervous discontent from NATO's southern flank, especially from Greece and Italy, the NATO countries closest to the fighting. In Athens tonight, 10,000 protesters marched on the U.S. Embassy, fighting with police and burning flags as they chanted anti-American slogans. That followed a statement from a Greek government spokesman saying, quote, "It's time to stop the bombing and seek a political solution." Tonight, Greek officials backed away from that somewhat, saying they are not breaking with their NATO allies. In Italy, the main staging point for U.S. airstrikes, the Prime Minister backed away from his statement of yesterday, calling for an immediate bombing halt. And in Rome, protesters disrupted Parliament. In Russia, protesters were out again today, and the Kremlin cranked up its pressure to stop the Allied attack, expelling 2 NATO representatives from Moscow. The Russians are traditionally allied with their fellow Orthodox Christians in Serbia. Here in the United States, hundreds of Serbian Americans turned out to protest in Chicago. The demonstration was loud but peaceful. President Clinton put out a videotaped message to the Serb people today. He tells them President Milosevic has endangered their future by forcing them into a senseless conflict. But the main message from President Clinton and his aides is aimed at holding together the alliance. Scott Pelley is at the White House. Scott?
Dan, keeping the alliance in line, of course, is the president's first priority, and tomorrow he is expected to make a number of calls to other NATO heads of state to encourage them to stick with the plan. Now, the Allies shared a good bit of intelligence today about the latest atrocities in Kosovo, and the Italians and the Greeks sent word privately to the White House that they are still on board. The president also warned today that Milosevic and his generals could be tried later as war criminals. Dan?
Scott Pelley at the White House. U.S. officials are keeping an especially nervous eye on Macedonia, the tiny Balkan country that borders the Serb province of Kosovo. During the past 24 hours, anti-American demonstrators have attacked the U.S. embassy in Macedonia. CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi is there.
U.S. Ambassador Christopher Hill, who spent months on an exhausting round of diplomacy to try to end the war in Kosovo, today surveyed the evidence that the conflict may be spreading. The American embassy was attacked by what were described as members of the Serb minority here. Macedonian security forces were on hand to ensure they got nowhere near the premises today. American soldiers serving with the UN Protection Force here were rushed in to beef up security inside the compound. The U.S. diplomatic mission here is classed as a small embassy post, which means it doesn't have a permanent Marine Guard contingent. With the way things are going in this part of the world, that may have to be reconsidered. The violence reflects anger at NATO bombing and fears about the growing number of ethnic Albanian refugees from Kosovo. An estimated 20,000 are already here, and Macedonia says it cannot cope with more. But news from Kosovo reaching the head of the expelled international monitoring mission indicates more will be on their way.
Stories of the police coming in masked, smashing doors, searching apartments are stories we're getting from some of our people that we left behind, locals.
In the meantime, the flag has been run up again. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Skopje.
The pictures of the Serb forces burning the villages and killing innocent civilians, then disappearing into the countryside, giving the impression that they're a ragtag guerrilla force. That perception is dead wrong. In Kosovo is a very ruthless and well-equipped force of 30,000 troops, 340 tanks, 250 armored personnel carriers, and approximately 280 artillery tubes, roughly the equivalent of 2 U.S. Army divisions, both in number of troops and firepower, all inside of an area about the size of the state of Maryland.
General, given the size and scope of those ground forces the Serbs have in Kosovo, what will it take for an air campaign to defeat them?
3 or 4 days, 3 or 4 weeks of very intense bombing.
3 or 4 weeks?
Weeks. And I'm talking about 200 to 300 sorties a day in mountainous terrain, under and around clouds, dodging heat-seeking missiles low to the ground with AAA as a threat. Make no mistake about it, Dan. We would lose airplanes and we would lose pilots, but we would break the back of the Serbian fighting force if only we have the political will and the national patience to see it through.
General Vasiloshin, thanks.
Our front and center. More tonight from Jeff Locke.
As the stealth bombers return from what the Air Force calls successful missions, those who have supported the much-maligned, multi-billion-dollar B-2 said essentially, "We told you so."
Both Congressman Dix and I agreed it was worth it.
Congressman Ike Skelton, whose Missouri district houses the B-2's only base, and Washington Democrat Norm Dix have been fighting the critics since 1980. What was once supposed to cost $270 million a plane ended up more like $2 billion. And the B-2 has had trouble flying in bad weather and with maintenance.
We have seen the kind of criticism on every single major weapon system, and then when we go to war, they work.
The Air Force is eager to capitalize on the success of this mission, letting reporters not only behind the controls of the simulator, but up close to the airplane as well. Still, despite its success, the question remains, is the tremendous cost worth it?
The plane is currently worth about 5 times its weight in gold.
Not worth it, says the publisher of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, despite all it does.
It is stealthy. It's not invisible to radar, but it is very, very difficult to detect at an enormous cost.
It is worth it, said the head of the Air Force today.
I'll tell you this, it's worth every penny if we save one American life.
Even in purely dollar terms, says the Defense Department. For example, hitting 16 targets could have taken 32 bombers, 16 escort jets, a few ground defense suppressor planes, and 15 tankers to refuel them all. The same 16 targets could be taken out by just one B-2. That's 75 aircraft, nearly 150 people, and $7.5 billion worth of planes versus just one B-2 with 2 pilots aboard. Tony Minetti, Brooklyn, New York, is ready for the next mission.
Between penetration, its long range, it's carrying 16 2,000-pound bombs in a stealth aircraft, you know, you combine all 4 of those assets together and you got yourself quite a package.
A package ready for more action if called upon in the NATO mission. I'm Jeff Locke, CNN at Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri.